a doctor that was retiring came across my radar, and I decided to make an appointment with him. And I kind of told him pretty much what I told you so far about, just that pulling away feeling. And he's like, puts his hand on my arm and says, "Dylan, let me stop you here. I'm pretty much sure that I can diagnose what it is that, what's causing all this." And I said, "You can?" Like, what? Like, tell me. He goes, "Do you want to know?" I said, "Obviously, yeah." And he said, "I'm pretty sure that, like, somewhere between the ages of, your younger childhood and maybe your younger teenage years, you were sexually molested. And it most likely was by a female." And that stunned me. I actually grew up, I was born in Kapuskasing, Ontario, which is, if you're not familiar with Ontario, it's a town in the far north.
Okay.
It's very remote. It's got about 12,000 people. Mainly they're French speaking. You'd think that Northern Ontario would be English, but it's actually, the town was like 90% French, which, I have a French last name, so...
Did you speak French?
Je parle un petit peu français.
Oh, sounds like
So, yeah, I speak a bit.
And how long did you live in Ontario?
We lived there, I think, till I was about 9 years old. My parents broke up when I was 6. My mom addressed my father's drug habit, and I personally think that my mom would have stayed with my father forever. My mom's very, very committed. Like, she wants to fix everything with her partner, and she obviously picked that up from somewhere, I'm guessing, through her childhood, fighting for my grandpa's love. Like, my grandpa even openly admitted that he favored her older sister and older brother. He made amends on his deathbed, and he sent out a message to me. I feel really actually bad about this, because this was the start of my drug addiction. I was mid-30s. I was like 35 when my grandpa passed away, and I was just getting to that point where I would say I was addicted to drugs. Like, I was pretty much ball and chain. I had to be like around a place that I knew I could have access to them. So the thought of me, my mom calls me and said, "Hey, come up to Terrace."
So this is in BC now?
Yeah, this is in BC. She goes, "Come up to Terrace, jump on a plane." I was, very wealthy at this time. She's like, "He might not make it through the night." And I think I was in Whistler at the time. And, I was just so self-centered, and, just the money had got to my head, and I just thought, I'm sure he'll be fine. And he didn't. He did pass away. And that's something like that hits like pretty heavy for me to think of, that I was just too into my money and my partying.
And this was back in the days when you were living large?
Yeah, I had a very interesting life, and maybe I'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
I lived way above the means of the usual 20 to 25-year-old at that time. To finish that point, my mom told me one day, we're going on a trip to the store. We're gonna go get a bunch of toys. And I remember passing the store, and we drove right by it. I knew even as a little kid that something was up, and I said, "Mom, like, we passed Woolworths," and she's like, "Dylan, we're gonna go to Sudbury. We're gonna do shopping when we get there." And I said, "Why? Why are we going to Sudbury?" And she said, me and you are gonna move there, and Mom's going to school there, and you're gonna go to school there, and we're not gonna see Dad for a while." And that was the end of it. I just remember I fell asleep, and I woke up, and I was in a new apartment, and I remember life there was okay. I moved out of there into another apartment. One was called Wellington. That was the good one. And then we moved to one called Kent Court, which I have nothing but dark memories around that place. It was kind of like a project style. It had like an A block, a B block, a C block, and a D block, and all these 4 big buildings in a square. And it had an old pool in the middle that was always empty, no water in it. And I remember a staircase going up to our building, this long concrete staircase. I remember that. I remember vaguely the apartment outlay. And I remember one party where my uncle was over, and I remember I was traumatized because he was teaching me how to make a hangman's noose. So that was stuck in my head because I was scared to death as a kid, right? That was my biggest fear, was dying. And that was the only real memories I had from that whole time at Kent Court. That's it. And then years ago, after many failed relationships, well, everyone saw it, I saw it, there was a pattern that would always happen. I would meet a girl, I would quickly be infatuated if I felt there was chemistry. I would put pretty much everything, like my full heart would go into it right away, like probably quicker than it should have. And then things would always seem to progress quickly where we'd move in together, you know, within months. It always seemed to happen. And then it was like a disease. The same thing would happen every time. The closer I would get to the person, like once we moved in together and once things were very like close and connected, I would start to get this awkward feeling about the sexuality. Like I'd go from the start where I was very comfortable to the closer I'd get to the person, I would become more withdrawn sexually. And usually it's the reverse. Like somebody meets somebody and they're like, okay, well, I don't know what you like, you don't know what I like we got to figure this out, this is weird, but you know, then it gets better and you work it out. Well, that's my interpretation from what I've seen other couples in movies, and I'm not saying everyone's like that, but mine was the opposite of that. And I always wondered why. And my mom would say, you know, when you find the right person, it'll come, it'll gel. So I had that hope in my mind. And then I finally thought I did find the right person when I was 25. I really wanted things with her to work out. Like, she was from a Muslim background. One of the things is I would have had to switch religions. I was even willing to do that. Like, you know.
Were you of a certain religion at the time?
Yeah, like I grew up going to Catholic school. At the end of, by grade 12, I would say I defined myself as atheist, if you would have asked. But, you know, I kind of wore the Catholic ribbon because of, that was where I went to school and my friends were all. But does that mean that I don't believe in there being a higher, like, I don't believe that this was all by fluke. Like, there was design to this, and who designed that? Who? I don't know. It's not the guy in the sandals, in my opinion, but somebody did it, and I'm open to you know, believing in there's some sort of higher power.
So, but in this case, you were going to have to go to a Muslim.
Yeah. So let's warp ahead now, and I lose this girl who, you know, I thought for sure I'd break the pattern with. I thought, oh, I'll never get that with her. That loss of sexual interest.
Yeah.
Just like clockwork. Once we got really close, the exact same thing happened. And you know, when that happened, I still had that urge. I still wanted sexuality in my life. Just couldn't be with them anymore. So I was a cheater. Well, she caught that right away and left me and went back to her ex, and her ex was someone that I knew very well, and I was, you know, it was like, it was in my face. I would see them out all the time, and it was very painful to go through that, because, you know, she would have nothing, wouldn't even acknowledge me. So I decided I'm going to go outsource whatever doctor I can, whatever psychologist, psychiatrist I can, who's the best of the best, because at that point I was, you know, financially well off. And a doctor that was retiring came across my radar, and I decided to make an appointment with him. And I kind of told him pretty much what I told you so far about, you know, just that pulling away feeling. And he's like, puts his hand on my arm and says, "Dylan, let me stop you here. I'm pretty much sure that I can diagnose what it is that, what's causing all this." And I said, "You can?" Like, what? Like, tell me. He goes, "Do you want to know?" I said, "Obviously, yeah." And he said, "I'm pretty sure that, like, somewhere between the ages of, your younger childhood and maybe your younger teenage years, you were sexually molested. And it most likely was by a female." And that stunned me. I was like, no. Like, right away, like, no, couldn't be. Like, what female? So I start thinking in my head like a Rolodex. I'm going through thoughts thinking, okay, my grandmother, hell no. Like, my grandma was the best grandma ever. My mom, no, obviously not. So I was totally stunned. I go, I can't think of anybody in my past. And he goes, "Well, either you don't want to divulge that to me here today, which is fine." And he goes, "I understand that." He goes, "At least you maybe got some closure and answers to what's causing this. And if that is the case, we can make a few alternate appointments and I'll give you things to work through that and how you can maybe rechange the script and feel better and work on that." He goes, "But if you truly can't remember," he said, "and you do want to, address those memories to kind of maybe start the healing process," he said, "I would suggest that we do hypnotism on you." And he said, "You'd have to come back in a week and I'd have to consult with my partner who's a hypnotist. You have to bring a friend in who's somebody who, can witness this, because he's like, I can't really hypnotize somebody without them bringing a friend." He was worried that people would say that, thoughts may have been implanted in their head under hypnosis. So
Could have a witness, yeah.
So yeah, he was covering his bases. I said, okay. So I ended up bringing a friend of mine who was actually an ex-girlfriend of mine who, been my friend for years. She came with me, and I briefly remember him hypnotizing me. He said, "Think of a cartoon character and think of him running up a wall, and he's upside down, and all the things are falling out of his pocket slowly, and a pencil falls, and this falls, and then wake up." That's all I remembered. And I was like, wake up? I'm like, I got to the part where the pencils are falling out.
So, Dylan, we're back. So we just had to move locations because we noticed the time and you had to do check-in at this place you're staying. So,
Ta-da! Here's the one of the amenities rooms.
yeah.
But I think when we last were talking, I was waking up from hypnosis. Yeah, and I said it felt like seconds to me, but like an hour on the clock it went by. And as soon as I looked up at my friend, the witness that I brought, my ex, I knew right away that definitely time had elapsed and that I had divulged something that was extremely sensitive, because she was all welled up and I could tell she'd been, through something emotional. So I was asked a very strange question by the psychiatrist and the hypnotist in that moment. The psychiatrist said, "There's two ways we can go about this," because he's like, "I'll be upfront with you. We were able to access some locked away memories you had of your past that are fairly sensitive. So I'm going to ask you a question. It might sound weird to you, but I'll explain it to you." He said, "Would you like to, from here on forward, look back at those memories and you'll only remember them like it was like you watched a movie? Like, you'll remember the storyline, but you won't necessarily believe nor remember that happened to you? Or would you like to actually live in the moment and remember it like, a fight you had with a friend last week? The hurt that you feel, the resentment. Like, do you want to go back to where you can feel feelings about it?" And I said, "Oh, wow, that's a big question." I said, how can you do that?" And he said, "Well, it just depends on how I recall the memory." He said if I go back and I ask you questions, you know, I slowly pull at the yarn and I ask you, hey, where did you live when you were this age? And what did you do? And where did you go to school? And I slowly work towards it and get you to remember, then it'll break down that wall, that barrier that you brought up. You know, you managed to put a mental block in. It'll bring that wall down, and you'll remember it just like it happened yesterday, and it'll involve the emotional side. But he's like, if I just go ahead and say, well, you told me this and this and this, or even if we replayed the video that we took of you and you watched yourself talking, it would be the hockey games going on. So
Overtime.
yeah, obviously we scored. Yeah, but he said if you know, you don't want to have any emotional attachment to it, I can either replay the video and you can watch yourself talk, which may be awkward. He said, or I can just kind of tell you verbatim what you said. And I said, whoa, geez, that depends, I guess. I said, I got one question to ask of you first. Does this involve any of my family? Were they any of the culprits in what you were about to tell me? And he said, no. And I was like, big sigh. So I said, then I want to know, because if it wasn't my family, then I want to know, like, you know, who was responsible and what happened, right? And I want to remember it in as much detail as I can in case I choose to, you know, do something about it. And he started asking me questions about where I lived when I was 7 years old. And I said, I lived with my mom. She had left my father, and we lived in a town, and she was a student and I was a student, and that was about it. And he said, well, did your mom go to day school or night school? And I said, let me think. I go, she was in university and she actually went to night school. And he said, oh, so you went to day school, obviously. And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, if you're in day school and your mom's in night school, who was taking care of you if your father wasn't in the picture? And I said, oh, I go, let me think. And I go, oh, that was my next door neighbor, Susan. And the second I said her name, that's when that wall broke down. And I just had a sinking feeling. And I remembered just this event over a year that took place of me being babysat by this woman. I was terrified of her. She was like in her 60s. She was like that wicked old witch librarian that, you know, you see in a movie. And I didn't like her at all, but my mom thought, oh, she was across the hall, she was convenient, she, you know, elderly lady, be perfect for babysitting. So the first couple of weeks I would sit in the hall and I wouldn't sleep anywhere but like at the front door, because I wanted to see my mom's high heels walk by, and I would open the door and come running and go, Mom, Mom, and then I would run into my own bed. Well, she quickly got annoyed with this, and she got mad at me and said, you lay in bed. I don't want you sleeping at the doorway like that. I'm here to take care of you, and I don't want you sleeping there anymore, because you could walk away, you could leave in the middle of the night and I wouldn't know. So I said, no, I want to see my mom come home, you know, because I didn't like this lady. I just felt really bad. So she comes home with a jar, like a mason jar, and it was full of bugs. And these bugs are like centipedes and spiders, and I'm terrified looking at them. Like I was like, wow. I go, where'd you get those? And she said, you want to know where? She goes, the carpet where you sleep at the front. She's like, I rolled it up to look because I saw some bugs come out of there. So I rolled it up, and she's like, all these bugs were under the carpet. They live there. I said, they live where I sleep in the hallway. She goes, oh yeah, all these bugs I picked out of there, and there's more. So she said, you know where there isn't any bugs? I said, where? And she's like, in my bedroom. She's like, no bugs. I looked everywhere, not a single one. So I'm off to her bedroom that night. And it was just a systematic, planned out I'm sure something that probably was from her childhood passed to her. Maybe not, but usually that's how it happens. Yeah, it was like this dominatrix relationship between a 7-year-old boy and a 60-some-year-old woman where she would demand me to do certain things, and if I didn't comply, she would ante up the punishment. Like, I'd be locked in a deep freezer. It'd be a minute, then it'd be 5, and then the punishments got worse and worse. And then finally, my mom announced after a year that I'm moving the family across the country from Ontario to Alberta to live with my parents, my mom's, my grandparents. And I remember being so excited, thinking that this was finally my time to get away from this lady. I wouldn't be babysat by her anymore. And she says to my mom, "Oh, I want him to come over because I have a special goodbye gift for him." And I was like, no, I don't want to go there, Mom. And she's like, "You get over there. Like, you be nice to her. Like, you should babysit her." And obviously I hadn't told my mom any of this because she had threatened me, She threatened, harm my family if I ever told them. She says to me, "I know you're moving across the country. Your mom gave me the address. I can find you. I can find your grandparents. And if you ever say anything about me," she's like, "I'll make sure that your mom and your grandparents and you're all dead." And I remember that being her parting words to me. And I honestly don't think I ever thought about her after we left. We pulled out of that apartment complex. I don't think that ever crossed my mind again until I was hypnotized. And it definitely answered a lot of questions as to why I react the way I do in relationships. And I have had some counseling post finding out, not from this doctor as he was retiring. I did it through a lady in West Vancouver, and she was helpful in giving me a bunch of tasks to work through to try to hopefully recognize and reverse those characteristics, because essentially the way a healthy person is in a relationship, they're standoffish at the start, and then as they build love for that person, they become closer sexually bonding with them. But for me, my brain was wired to see sex as like an evil punishment, but it's still like an animalistic behavior that we have to procreate. So I would still have the urge to be sexual, but it was a very dark urge. Like, it was something you do like in the recesses of secrecy, and you to be honest, like, I could barely recall like any experiences I've had sexually with any of my girlfriends nor random partners, with exception to a few. It's almost like, when you're driving on the highway and you have a 2-hour drive and you're like, "Oh, bummer, 2 hours." And then you get off into a thought that before you know it, you're already pulling into the town. You go, "Where did the 2 hours go? Like, how did I even navigate my way here? I was in my own brain. Like, how did I even drive?" I put myself into a kind of a hypnotic state where I'm not really thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just going through the motions to fulfill an urge, but I'm not connecting in the moment, and I'm kind of scrubbing it out of my memory as it's happening. So I can barely tell you, like I said, in my life, with exception to maybe a handful of times, and I don't know why those specific times, if it was a comfort thing but most of them I've erased them. But it provided a lot of answers.